Okay, looks like we're back recording. So again, this is Transport Food Safely from your central kitchen to satellite sites. And I am presenting it, Kathy Spencer, Senior Environmental Specialist from the Health Department. So what I want to get started with is some key terms. We're going to go into more detail on these terms during the presentation, but I do want you to kind of have a general working knowledge of these terms that will be used during this presentation. So time temperature control, or TCS foods, are foods that are required to be kept or hot or cold to limit bacterial growth. An SOP, or a standard operating procedure, is a set of step-by-step instructions that are put in place so that tasks are performed consistently by workers using them. A central kitchen is a kitchen. It's a food site where the food's prepared. It can be cooking, slicing, dicing, pouring, etc. All of those are preparation steps. All central kitchens that you're using should have a food permit with ADH. A satellite or remote site is a separate feeding site that receives and serves food prepared at the central kitchen. Food has to be transported to the satellite site from a central kitchen to be a satellite site. Time as the public health control, or TPHC, that a lot of you guys affectionately call the 4-hour rule, is kind of a policy that may be adopted to limit the amount of time that food is available when active temperature control of the food cannot be maintained. So our objectives for after viewing this presentation: you should be able to define and identify what TCS foods are, identify what equipment you should be using for active temperature control versus what approved equipment is good to use as transport containers, have an idea of how to write an SOP for food transportation from a satellite or from a central kitchen to a satellite site, and know how to write and use an SOP for time as a public health control policy if you are unable to maintain foods within temperature control after transporting them. Oh, go back one. TCS food is a food that requires time and temperature control to prevent the growth of microorganisms and the production of toxins. So this food contains moisture and protein and has a neutral or slightly acidic pH. Most bacteria need nutrients such as carbohydrates or proteins to survive. So it's going to include animal foods that are raw or heat treated, food of plant origin that is heat treated or consisted of raw seed sprouts, cut melons, cut leafy greens, cut tomatoes, or mixtures if the cut tomatoes are not modified in a way so that they are unable to support pathogenic bacteria or toxin formation, or garlic and oil mixtures for the same reason. So we've got some pictures of the cut tomatoes, the sprouts, the leafy greens, the cut watermelon. Those are really kind of the raw produce that you would need to worry about being a TCS food. And then you see we have the raw chicken and cooked chicken because it's an animal food, and milk, which is a big one for all of us in the feeding programs. So temperature control means that you're going to keep it hot or cold using equipment designed to keep hot foods hot and cold foods cold. So hot foods need to be 135. For you guys in the feeding programs, that is actually 140. And for cold foods, that's going to be 40 degrees for you guys. And that area between hot and cold holding is what we call the danger zone, because that's where a lot of bacteria are most likely to grow. So these are some good examples of temperature control equipment. It's usually equipped with thermometers and usually has an electrical power source and a thermostat that activates cooling and heating processes. So those common equipment would be like food warming cabinets, steam wells, cold wells, your refrigerators and freezers. Again, electric, they can blow hot air and cold air continuously. Okay. Transport containers, those are what you're going to actually use during transportation. So they're usually going to be rigid and sectioned and well enough that foods do not mix, tightly closed so that they can retain proper food temperature, non-porous to avoid leakage, and easy to clean or disposable. And And most importantly, they do need to be approved to hold food as well. So if you are transporting food, we do require that you write an SOP from your central kitchen to the satellite sites. Whenever you write an SOP of any type, you need to state what tasks need to be done, who will do them, who monitors to make sure the tasks are completed, and address common problems that might occur during the procedure. Also, you need to make a note of any records that need to be kept with a procedure. So this page is kind of a sample SOP of how I would write one for a feeding program. And so I've got at first what will be done and who will do it. So, you know, you're listing who's taking the temperature of the food, what time that's approximately done, who's packing the foods in insulated bags, who's unpacking it, you know, the times associated with it. Again, when you're assigning tasks, you can either use a person's name if you're a small operation, or maybe you just want to put this is the prep chef, or this is volunteer number one has this to do. But it is important you assign those tasks so that you can make sure it's done and how, and then note how your problems should be fixed. So let's say this person, they just have a real time keeping the milk cold, and they just like, you know, it's just been taking too long to do this. We're going to start using shelf stable milk because we don't want to do that. So you can put that as part of your contingency plan as something to work with. And then I've got, you know, a food delivery log and a mileage log is what records I wanted to keep on that particular SOP. So, you know, there is freedom to do that, but you're going to be answering those same basic questions. What's going to be done, who's going to do it, who's going to make sure it's done, and how the problems are fixed, and what records need to be kept. And so you are going to want to limit distance and travel time from your central kitchen to your satellite site. Ideally, that doesn't exceed 1 hour. You want to keep a delivery record for food that is transported. A copy of the record remains at the site that receives the delivered food until that food has been eaten or thrown away. So you might need to have one with your delivery driver and another record for your site. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you've got food that's got a delivery record, you need some of that with the food at the site until that food is thrown away or eaten. So when you are transporting food, there can be many issues regarding temperature control. You do come up with some temperature loss during the packing process. There's not a way to add heat and cold during transport process without electricity, and that's usually a lot harder to do. Cold and heat packs have limited surface area, so even though you put those in there, they may not be enough to keep it. They might keep it warm enough that it feels good to your mouth, but it may not be hot enough to limit bacterial growth. And then we have a special problem with cardboard cartons of milk. They cannot be in direct contact with the ice, so they can be ice can be in a Ziploc bag, or you can use a freezer pack or a gel pack that puts a layer between what's frozen and the cardboard container, and it's just because we don't want water degrading the quality of the cardboard container. So when you have a lot of issues with temperature control in the transport process, you can adopt what we call time as the public health control policy. Again, a lot of you guys call that the 4-hour rule. It uses time alone to limit bacterial growth rather than temperature. It is an SOP that is required to be submitted to the ADH feeding program compliance specialist during your application process. And then once you have chosen to do that, you are limited to 4 hours to get the food into the children's bellies before it is thrown away, and that 4-hour window needs to include packaging, transporting, unpacking, and feeding the children. So there's a lot that needs to happen in that 4 hours. And then, so why do we choose 4 hours? And I wish I could take credit for this, but one of my co-workers in Benton County, Miss Mary Jo Root, who's an inspector up there, did this visual aid a few years ago. but there are bacteria such as E. coli that double their numbers in 20 minutes. So the picture on the screen, we're using rice in the place of an E. coli, but just one is going to multiply itself into 8 grains within an hour. By the end of 2 hours, you have 64. By 3 hours, you have 32,768 grains. At the end of 3 hours, 40 minutes, that single grain of rice could have multiplied into enough to fill 41-gallon bags of shear rice. So that last picture there is a full gallon bag of rice, and so there would be 41 gallons of that, or 2,097,152 E. coli cells on your food if you started with one single bacterium of E. coli in the food. So that's why we do the 4 hours, because it just, when it's still within 3 hours, it's pretty limited. But once you get to that 4th hour, it really needs to be gone after the end of that 4 hours, because there's just so much growth that happens. So to write an SOP for its TPHC, we really want you to be very specific about it and list your specific types of foods, where it's going to be held, if the food's a working supply, ready-to-eat food, if it needs to be cooled beforehand, describe how it's going to be cooled before the time as public health control 4 hours begins, describe how the container is going to be marked so that you can see that it's going to be discarded within 4 hours, and identify who is responsible for each task. Again, you can identify that person by their name or their title, just depending what works for you, how big your operation is. And so we have an example, and this is the handout that you can download with this presentation, is this sheet that kind of guides you through what we want with an SOP. So you must have a written SOP to use time as public health control, and you have to keep that at your central kitchen for review. State when and how the food is marked to show disposal time at 4 hours, and then you're going to state how you're going to dispose of the food, either when the time limit has expired or if the food containers are not marked properly. And so this is a common question we get, and when does time begin? And it does get a little confusing, but time begins immediately after a temperature measurement when the food is still within critical temperature limits. So the food needs to be hot or cold when time begins, or you can begin with a shelf-stable food. But if you're working with tuna, for instance, and you make tuna with mayonnaise, and you mix those two together and they're both shelf-stable, it begins right when you mix them together. But it's got to be hot or cold for most stuff. If it's cooked and coming out of hot holding, or if it's cold and coming out of a refrigerator, that's usually when it does. Or you can do it immediately after cooking. But say you don't have hot holding equipment, but you make, a bunch of hamburger patties, you can begin that 4 hours immediately after you take that cooking temperature. Again, that is as long as it's within its critical temperature and you mark it immediately, identify immediately. So the next slides kind of go through some examples of when you would start and end time as a public health control. So these are kind of 3 common scenarios to help you determine when that 4 hours begins. So let's say in all 3 of these scenarios, you're going to start with hamburger patties that are cooked to 180 degrees, so they're well above the cooking temperature that's required for hamburger patties. In the first scenario, you place them into trays and you keep them in the warmer cabinet. You move them into the transport container at 10 a.m. and then load them into the delivery van. The patties were 145 when packed into the insulated carrier. In the second scenario, you're going to place them into trays and keep them in the warmer cabinet as well, but you're going to move them into the transport container at 9 a.m., then load it into the delivery van. But when you took the temperature of the patties when they were packed at 9 a.m., they were 125. And then in the third scenario, you're placed into trays and immediately packed into the transport container. So You want to go to the next slide. So in the first scenario where you place them in and you kept them in hot hold and they were still well above the hot holding temperature when they were packed, you can start that time at 10 a.m. when they were packed, and that 4 hours would end at 2 p.m. In the second scenario, when they were 125, when you packed them at 9 a.m., you would actually start that at 8 a.m. because they were still within the hot holding temperature. But you would need to have marked them at 8 a.m. to serve them until noon. And then in the third scenario, you have them placed into the trays immediately and passed it into the transport container. So you automatically know you're starting that at 8 a.m. And ending that at noon, which is 4 hours later. So when that food arrives at the satellite site, it needs to be clearly marked as described in your SOP for using the 4-hour time as a public health control rule. A copy of any of the delivery logs or time marking information should be maintained with the food until service has finished and any leftover items have been discarded. And there always needs to be someone in charge there of overseeing that the food is stored in a way that prevents tampering before it's served, because you never know, even when you're working with kids, they just get interested and they touch things they don't need to. So do make sure that someone is there. And so where is the food when time as public health control ends at the end of that 4 hours? It either needs to be in somebody's belly and served and eaten already, or it's in the trash can. Like there is no saving that food after that 4 hours begins, because remember those 41 gallons of rice, gallon bags of rice, that's a lot of bacteria that can grow after the end of that 4 hours. So other issues you need to consider with transportation are that you can't store or transport chemicals together with the food. Even if you don't need the bleach or even if you need bleach for sanitizing, you're not going to pack it in the same bag as your crackers. It could spill or leak into the food. There are bumps in roads, stuff bumps around and shifts, so be careful how you pack your food up. And then someone, again, does need to be with the food once it arrives at the satellite site. Your food program is responsible for someone being there to make sure that food is not tampered with before feeding served to the children in your feeding program. And then whatever vehicles you are transporting food into any site are subject to being inspected for food safety. Again, like these are storage. It's an extension of your food permit that these are being used to store and transport the food under your permit. So we will inspect those. In summary, time and temperature control for safety foods require a combination of time and temperature control to limit the bacterial growth. So even when you start to use time as a public health control, you start it with a temperature that they start at a good temperature when you start that to limit the bacterial growth. And then if you're transporting food from a central kitchen to a satellite site, you're going to need to write an SOP and keep a delivery log with the food. Time as a public health control, that 4-hour rule, that's an additional precaution. And it does require its own SOP when temperature control is hard to maintain during food transportation. Items need to be clearly marked and have to be thrown away if they are not eaten 4 hours after that time had begun. So this is some of the common questions we kind of see. So the first frequently asked question I have, when do you mark the TCS food? And so immediately when it begins, unmarked or improperly marked foods must be thrown away. If you cannot mark the food appropriately, you cannot serve it, and you will not be reimbursed. When you use that time as a public health control 4-hour rule, can you save the food and serve it later? No, that's a one-way street. Once the time as public health control 4 hours begins, food cannot be returned to temperature control, e.g. refrigerated, frozen, reheated, or hot held to be saved and served later. You chose time as a public health control. You chose that 4-hour. You cannot change your mind and serve it as leftovers later. And then the third one, if you mix different batches of food in the same container, how do you apply the 4-hour rule? And I would say the best thing to do is avoid mixing those batches together in the same container. If you do decide that, your food is as old as the oldest thing in there. So if your oldest ingredient has been used already for 3.5 hours and you put new stuff on top of that and mix it in, it's still going to expire in 30 minutes because you still have those 3.5 hours of a large bacteria load in that older food item. So if you have other questions or concerns, that's my contact information. I recommend the easiest way to get a hold of me and get me to answer questions is email, because sometimes some of your questions do require me to do a little bit of research before I can answer them outright. But that is the 501-661-2171 is the main phone number. You can also talk to your local EHS at your county health unit if you wish.
All right. Hello, guys. This is Cecil Chu from HMP, Health and Nutrition Unit. We will conclude this webinar today with any questions that you all may have, okay? So we will take this time out. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and type those questions and send them through to us. Do you know what I'm doing? I think it's still be beneficial. You guys have any questions that you guys would like answered on today? Keep in mind, all of our recorded webinars will be on our YouTube channel. I will forward you guys that link. That way you guys can navigate through that. You can go back on your own time and look at those webinars, okay? It's a great resource for you guys to reflect back on at any point in time. You guys need that extra assistance, you guys can just go on to those webinars, okay? All right, so if you guys do not have any questions, we'll go ahead and conclude this webinar on today. Thank you all for attending. Goodbye.